Yep.
All right, so good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. Happy New Year and welcome to our first BPAC meeting of the year. I hope everyone was able to stay safe and healthy over the holidays. As a quick reminder, please keep yourself muted unless you want to speak. You can also use the raise hand function in the top right of the screen. Ben Gramling, our environmental planning manager, will be monitoring the chat box, so please feel free to ask any questions or make any comments in there. And without further ado, I'll start with the agenda. So here's the agenda for today's meeting. As usual, we'll quickly recap the work that has been done since our December meeting. I'll start by giving you a brief update on our regional transportation plan that you all were involved in developing. And then Ashley Reeves from our research and data team and I will continue our presentation on the bike and pedestrian crash analysis we've been working on. And then we'll end with some next steps and member updates. So the draft RTP is out for public review and comment, which is a 30-day period, and I'll go into more detail in that presentation. But at this point, I'll hand it off to Councilwoman Henderson to give us a brief update on the speed limit reduction bill that is currently going through the Metro Council. Councilwoman Henderson, whenever you're ready.
Thank you, Daniel. Can you hear me?
Yep, can hear you just fine.
Okay, thank you so much. So this is an ordinance that's on 3 readings and just passed this past Tuesday unanimously. And I think this has been a long time coming somewhat. I think when a lot of us on Metro Council ran for office in 2015, the first time, concern around neighborhood speeding, cut through speeding, traffic calming, and so forth were very much top of mind for a lot of our citizens. This legislation brings a countywide reduction. That said, though, in our urban services district. So as you all know, when we did city-county consolidation back in 1963, we kept the distinction between urban services district and general services district, with general services being, somewhat, though not always, more rural in nature. And so this would bring a reduction to 25 miles per hour as the kind of default base speed limit for all neighborhood classified streets. And what I'm finding from some feedback from constituents is broad support, but sometimes some confusion around what is a neighborhood classified street. I often have constituents that are on kind of a neighborhood collector who think they might be on a neighborhood street, but a map presented by our Public Works Department is getting a lot of engagement. It was the most linked link in my January newsletter. And so I think this has broad support from the council and the community, and we are hearing from folks representing the GSD and from citizens there that they also have an interest in this. So I'm a co-sponsor of this legislation. I want to also thank Councilwoman Allen for her leadership, as well as other co-sponsoring colleagues. Council Lady Allen was instrumental in some early efforts kind of piloting in Nashville called walking districts. And while I did have some concern about those, because I think every neighborhood should be a walking district, and I don't want us to kind of piecemeal this across 532 square miles. They did provide a good, again, kind of pilot data to show that in changing that speed that was supported by the neighborhood, and it did make some improvements in safety. So that was an important precursor. And I think for us as a city, it will be important once this passes that we likewise appropriately fund and staff traffic calming. And so this will just roll out in coordination with our brush pickup, our quarterly brush pickup that moves around the city in zones. It's had an $85,000 fiscal note, and it will be implemented by Public Works staff in concert with the brush pickup schedule. So my district, would perhaps, and Public Works has not really made a timeline commitment, but might see this as early as April. I think what we'll also get is sort of some kind of follow-on knock-on effect with our Traffic and Parking Commission of folks now wanting their default collector speed of 35 to be reduced to 30. And I've already had some success with that, as have my colleagues on some of those streets already being reduced through our Traffic and Parking Commission. Communities can still, if they feel that 20 is plenty for their area, through the traffic calming program or still through the commission, folks can have, a street signed at 20 miles per hour. And so with that, I think our next third and final reading will be this coming Tuesday, and we anticipate a passage at that time, and then Public Works moving into the implementation phase. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Councilwoman Henderson. I think we're all pleased to hear that the bill has widespread support. I think a speed limit reduction doesn't solve all our bike ped safety issues, but it's definitely a step in the right direction. Does anyone have any questions for Councilwoman Henderson before we move on?
Daniel, this is Sean. I just added in the chat box. I think that this is great. I was curious if any other cities or in the region or in the state of Tennessee have done this previously.
Sean, I am not aware of them. What I will share, I'm encountering, because we're city-county consolidated, my district has a pretty even split between our urban services district and our general services district. And internal to our general services district, we have some cities that were existing before consolidation. So for me, that's Forest Hills, Oak Hill. I'm also adjacent to the city of Belmead. Those cities administer their own roads and speed limits. And so I have kind of been planting the seeds with those commissions and city managers for quite some time, anticipating this change, so that where we have kind of boundary streets, that some of those smaller communities might move in that direction. I sense sometimes that there's some trepidation around this, but I have been particularly engaged with my constituency, having run on a Safe Streets platform. I find very broad support for this. So I would say to kind of any and all small communities, that citizens are supportive of this. I think it's, it is a culture change somewhat. You do get a little bit of pushback on, well, it's just a number on a sign and it doesn't matter. And, to a certain extent, I think we all know that is correct, because the context of the road, how wide it is. And I think that was some of the concern in our kind of their GSD, more rural areas. But we have some very suburban areas that, the roads are just, you could land aircraft on them. So I think, context matters for some of these adjacent communities, but certainly in some of our ring counties, at least the downtown areas and Main Street areas and some of those more traditional development patterns could absolutely support this, and probably in some communities even 20 miles per hour. So I just mentioned that because I serve a majority Republican, pretty conservative district. And I think sometimes people think that aligns with folks not supporting something like this. But I do have very broad support in some of my more conservative communities. So thank you.
Peter, I think you've got a question. You can go ahead.
Sure. Thank you. Council Lady Henderson, this is Peter Westrom with GNRC. I appreciate all your efforts on this legislation. I know it's been a long time coming, and applaud all the work that you and others have done on this. Just a quick question. And I really appreciate the point you were just making around the built environment being a complementary component of speed traveled. Is there any expectation or any conversations you've had with either the mayor's office or other council members that anticipate trying to provide some sort of improvements to the built environment that would complement the posted reduction in speed?
I appreciate the question. I've been publicly very vocal and internal to our Public Works Committee, and have mentioned to the administration, particular both to our capital spending plan that's anticipated in February and also our next round of operational budget, that it's important that this change, very much needed, largely a kind of a culture change somewhat, be aligned with physical on the street changes. At present funding levels, our traffic calming program, we have 180 neighborhoods / kind of street areas in the queue for traffic calming. At present funding, we can do 25 of those per year. So in my view, that is insufficient. And because we are, decades and decades behind on this, I have always asserted that traffic calming, safe crossings, and so forth have the best return on investment. We get a lot of talk about sidewalks, and I think I've been one of the strongest advocates for more sidewalk funding and better process implementation on sidewalks. But I really think we can deliver the aligned safety needs through intentional kind of programmatic work around traffic calming. So Mr. Hagerty and our Public Works Department, we used to contract traffic calming out to a contractor. And I think, it was a pretty, in my view, as a neighborhood association president, somebody engaged with it, I didn't think it was a good or effective program. So I'm glad we brought it in-house, but now we need to fund it and staff it appropriately. So yes, I have conveyed this to the administration. I have encouraged all my colleagues on the Public Works Committee, and I also did a call to action in my newsletter to ask citizens to make the same request to our mayor's office. So that's just kind of from my perspective. But yes, I hope we will all, advocacy community and otherwise, join in advancing that, because this shouldn't just be kind of a check the box, we change the speed. It has to be aligned with infrastructure improvement, and we can scale traffic calming, bring the equity that we need to communities that were kind of historically disinvested, and with safe crossings, access to parks, access to schools, through traffic calming. And I really just think we should robustly fund that and staff that up as well. Thank you.
Sean Santaya from FHWI, so you have your hand raised. You can go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, Daniel, and thank you, Councilwoman Henderson. I'm sure you've gotten this question numerous times before, but what are you guys planning as far as any education or enforcement campaigns associated with this?
So I don't know if our mayor's office is represented here today or Walk Bike, but through our Walk and Bike strategic plan several years ago, having a Vision Zero master plan was part of that, and I know that Walk Bike has coordinated on some education efforts, and I think we put out to RFP a Vision Zero master plan, but I am unclear on kind of the status of where that is from an education effort standpoint. So perhaps somebody other than me could speak to that, please.
Miranda and Robert, I think you both have your hands raised. I don't know who went first, but both of you feel free to go.
Okay, this is Miranda. Can you hear me? Oh, Yes.
Yes, we can hear you.
Yes, okay. Yeah, I just wanted to comment on the Vision Zero action plan. That is in progress. The contract has been finalized as of this morning. So we have the kickoff meeting with our internal Metro staff group mid-February, and then the project will be taking place throughout the year. And I'll be glad to provide more information on that, or if anyone needs it now, or at the end of the meeting, whatever you would like. But that is underway. So,
Miranda, I think we can probably leave that until the end of the meeting. We've got a section at the end for member updates, so we can spend more time talking about that then. Is that okay?
Yes, that's fine. And I'm actually here. Marty Sewell could not attend today, so he asked me if I could attend in his place. So, but I'll be glad to do that. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Michael or Robert, did you guys have anything to add?
Yeah, sure. It's Robert from Walk Bike Nashville. Good morning. Yes, once again, want to echo everybody else's thanks to Councilmember Henderson on this. Is absolutely great. Yes, there's a little committee been formed to look at how to do education and outreach around the speed limit reduction. We were initially very concerned about negative reactions, although, as the council member says, actually it seems like more and more people want to be in the speed reduction zone. But anyway, we were concerned about that, and yes, the Public Works Department and Walk Bike Nashville, we're having discussions about exactly how the education component of that will look, and how we'll proceed with that. Absolutely.
Michael, do you have a question?
Hey there, and I'm switching topic a little bit, and I apologize for dogs barking in the background. And it gets back to the question that I think Sean asked about other cities having similar ordinances. I know GNRC typically wants to kind of push out maybe model ordinances or a toolkit that some other cities and counties could use in the region. And I think this is a good topic that might be helpful for some cities and counties to have at their fingertips, particularly working with TDOT and speed limit reductions there. I think they get a lot of local input that factors into that, and you see just a wide variety of speed limits in some of our local towns, where when you hit the downtown district, there's usually like a lowering of speed limits. So just wanted to put that out there, that might be a good action item in the future for us to explore as a group with you all as staff at a regional level, to have model practice or a toolkit handy for local staff.
Michael, thank you for that comment. I totally agree, and I think that's definitely something we should add to a future meeting agenda. So in the interest of time, thank you so much, Councilwoman Henderson. I think all of us would agree that it's really nice to have a champion for bike ped safety as an elected official. So thank you so much for giving us an update, and I'll move into our regional transportation plan update. So I'll start by noting that the draft plan is out for public review and comment. It's a 30-day public review and comment period as required by our public participation plan. The public notice has gone out to the 3 newspapers on the screen, as well as information by email to you all last week, included with today's agenda. Next, I'll take you through where you can access the draft plan and documents on our website. So if you go to gnrc.org and you go to Browse by Topic, underneath Transportation and Mobility, there's a tab that says Regional Transportation Plan. And this will take you to the draft plan and all related documents. You can also go directly to this link at gnrc.org/draftrtp. You'll find all the chapters to the plan as well as the technical appendices, which includes a complete list of candidate projects and illustrative priorities. You'll also find an interactive project map application of the proposed projects in the plan, thanks to our awesome data team. You can take a look at all of the projects included in the draft plan. You can view the project locations, the descriptions, costs, the time horizon that the project is funded in. And this application has a couple of tabs across the top where you can view the projects by applicant, by improvement type, by funding horizon. You can also pull up select layers like traffic congestion, high crash areas, and the vulnerable populations we presented to you a few months ago. I encourage you to check this app out, and the link is on the bottom of the screen at gnrc.org/maps/2045RTP. So back in 2020, and with this group's guidance, we spent some time discussing and developing a project evaluation methodology for the projects submitted to this plan. So in appendices E and F, you'll find full documentation of the project level indicators and staff qualitative analysis that we use to evaluate projects. The one shown on the screen is for congestion management. So just a quick recap of the timeline of this RTP schedule. Back in October 2019, we had a kickoff at the FRIST, where we also announced a call for projects. Starting in February, we focused on some of the financial planning assumptions, including the different sources of revenue we could expect throughout the life of the plan. Through the summer, we focused on a lot of the existing conditions and trends for safety, congestion, and growth and development. And then as we got into the fall, we transitioned into project evaluation and scoring and started to prioritize them into the draft plan. So our Transportation Policy Board then endorsed our draft plan for state and federal compliance review in October. And we've gone through that compliance review, and today we're presenting a draft plan that addresses comments from the compliance review and reflects what we've released for public review and comment over the next month before the board is expected to adopt the plan next month. One other reminder that we want to mention, as a result of the pandemic, there were a number of changes that were necessary. When we initially set out to do the plan, we had a Solve This Together initiative that focused on addressing a lot of the region's mobility issues, and we set out to achieve some big projects and potentially expanding some of the revenue sources available to us. But as we've gone through the pandemic, some of these assumptions have changed, and we've scaled back to a more constrained vision for this plan. So now I'll jump into a summary of the investments through 2045 that are included in the plan. There are a number of itemized projects that are included in the maps I'll be presenting. As I've mentioned to you all before, the $8.5 billion across the life of the plan, this map reflects the share of those projects that have been itemized. So it's a smaller share of that investment. About 122 projects are represented on that itemized list and account for about $4.8 billion in federal funds. Looking at how those projects accomplish some of the goals in our plan, nearly all of those projects are located in what we've identified as the top 25% high crash areas. So that's defined as the crash frequency over the past 5 years. We look at traffic congestion. Approximately 2/3 of those projects are located in a top 10% congested area, and that's defined as a percent of free flow speed. And if we look at how it relates to some of the environmental data layers that we looked at, nearly 90% of the projects are located in proximity to the environmentally sensitive areas, which we defined as the number of environmental factors that we've looked at. And just as we evaluated active transportation projects through the BPAC priority areas, staff evaluated projects based on how they impact the environment. And similarly for vulnerable populations, approximately 1/3 of the projects are located in what we've identified as highly vulnerable areas, which are 6 or more vulnerable populations based on the 9 population groups we've identified. And also through the staff analysis, we determine what the impacts would be on the communities in these areas. So if we look at these investments by project set, which are the categories or groupings of projects, of that $8.5 billion in federal funds, about a third are programmatic investments. So this includes some TDOT maintenance projects and transit formula funds for WeGo and other transit agencies within the region. And then there are also buckets of funding for CMAQ, which TDOT administers, and the Active Transportation Program, which I'll talk about in the next slide. So you'll see that a significant share of the itemized projects is going to Improve Act projects submitted by TDOT. So I've mentioned the Active Transportation Program to you all before, but through the RTP and our Transportation Improvement Program, we will be setting aside about $105 million over the life of the plan for the Active Transportation Program. So projects funded through this program are active transportation focused and must advance regional initiatives to improve availability, safety, and convenience of bike ped users. We'll be having a separate call for projects for this program in the spring. In the past, BPAC has been involved. I think some of you probably were involved the last time we did this in the qualitative review process for the projects submitted to this program. So in past years, we've supported projects depending on whether the project is an infrastructure project or not, and we'll likely use BPAC priority areas in our project scoring as well. So look for that in the spring. I haven't gone through this process before, so I'm looking forward to working with you all on this. So this shows funding by prior commitment. You'll see that a significant portion of projects are already in the TIP. Between the TDOT and locally submitted projects already in the TIP, those projects account for about half the investments made over the life of this plan. So these are some of the key takeaways in looking through the plan. The region's plan is pretty dependent on federal grant programs. If we look at some of our peer regions, other regions have some supplemental state and local funding that's included in their plans, but our region is relying on a larger share of federal funding. So cost increase to projects also factor in as a result of construction or right of way. And another thing to mention is that we're still trying to get a handle on the revenue that the Improve Act provides over the next 25 years. Most of this plan is a commitment to Improve Act projects and a significant share of local projects that are currently in the TIP. A lot of those prior commitments are driving the investments over the long term. And then finally, as a region, we need to work with the state to bring additional funding to move some of these major investments over the long term to solve some of our major transportation issues. So here is a schedule for the RTP going forward. We released the draft on January 15th. We're scheduled to have an official public hearing next month at the Transportation Policy Board meeting. And we are hosting our first public workshop on February 4th at 5:30 p.m. where staff will present the draft plan and will be available to answer any questions about the plan during that time. So I encourage all of you to attend that. That's all I've got for the RTP update. Does anyone have any questions or comments before we dive into our crash analysis? All right, sounds good. I will go ahead and dive into the crash analysis. So last month, we presented some initial findings from the bike ped crash analysis we've been working on. So to give a brief recap of that presentation, what led us to this analysis is to better understand the factors that contribute to bike ped crashes so that we can better focus planning and investments towards improving safety for bike ped users. We also want to coordinate better with all of you and other stakeholders to guide strategies from the 6 E's we've been talking about, because we realize that infrastructure is not the only solution. enforcement, education, and equity are also equally important elements, and we have to figure out how to better work together towards a more comprehensive solution, so we're not just spinning our wheels. And that goes back to a conversation we were just having with Councilwoman Henderson about enforcement and education. So I think this is very timely. These are the factor groups we presented initial crash data on last month. The built environment infrastructure piece, destinations that are commonly associated with biped crashes, and some of the user behavior that contributes to higher crash risk and exposure. These are some of the key takeaways from last time. I grouped them all together. So from a high level, non-motorized crashes are a small percentage of total crashes, but we found that they're more likely to be severe. Pedestrian fatalities have increased at twice the rate of total fatalities between 2015 and 2019. Serious injuries have been almost cut in half, some due to the change in definition, but non-motorist serious injuries have remained constant over the past 5 years. In terms of the built environment and infrastructure, bike and pedestrian fatalities occur disproportionately on principal arterials, so the Pikes, Murfreesboro Pike, Dickerson Pike. I think we've seen that a lot this year or I guess last year in 2020. And then a majority of the pedestrian fatalities we looked at occur in dark conditions. And then just to recap the destinations and behavior piece, we saw that school zones work. So outside of the quarter mile that school zones are designated for, we saw a dramatic increase in crashes outside of those zones. We also saw that crashes are more likely to occur near transit stops, so more specifically within 500 feet. We saw that the highly vulnerable areas we've been talking about represent a disproportionate share of severe biped crashes. And we found that there was an increase in biped crash severity during the winter months, so outside of that daylight savings time period. So these key takeaways are really our initial findings. So in the last month, we've taken a deeper dive into a more systemic analysis. So this slide shows how different crash analyses and data can be used for different outcomes. So the more traditional analysis is a hotspot analysis, the one you see on the left, which looks at specific locations that have a high crash frequency and then identifies why those crashes are happening there. And then that helps us prevent future crashes from occurring. But what we're going to be presenting to you today is a deeper level of analysis in what we call the Biped Safety Index, which shows us not only areas that have a prior crash history based on the factors we presented on, but also analyzes some of the common conditions that make an area more susceptible to biped crashes, even if that location doesn't have a prior crash history. So this really allows us to take a more proactive approach to identify and prioritize locations with unsafe biped conditions to prevent crashes from occurring. I want to be clear that we're not predicting future crashes. Really what this index can help us with is looking at the bike and pedestrian safety issue on a more systemic level, where we can look at the issue more comprehensively, which means that the applications of this index can be more widespread. So since we generally have limited funding available for bike and pedestrian safety improvements, I think this tool can help us prioritize those improvements to have a more effective short-term impact. So tools like this can be used in combination with things like the latent demand analysis that we've done, and then we can see how crashes are reactive to exposure, and really all of these combined make up a systemic analysis, which hasn't really been done in our region, and I think given the uptick and especially pedestrian fatalities, I think it's time to figure out what some of the best short-term solutions are. So these are just a few of the applications we think the index can help inform, at least on GNRC's side of the equation. So first, just as our BPAC priority areas helped inform project evaluation in the RTP, we think it can help inform future project evaluation and planning processes. And as I mentioned before, the Active Transportation Program also has a project evaluation component. And I think the index could help us prioritize funding for those projects. Recently, we've been looking into getting more involved in TDOT's roadway safety audits, which look at specific locations and recommend safety improvements based on a safety analysis, which is a perfect way for us to plug in this analysis. And then any other local or state planning studies or reports could use this index to inform decision-making when it comes to biped safety. I will mention that after the presentation today, we want to hear from all of you on how you would use this index and what kinds of things you're working on that it could inform. But before I say any more, I'll hand it off to Ashley to present the index and a few examples of the analysis she's been working on. So Ashley, take it away.
Awesome, thanks Daniel. So we broke this sort of index into 3 different categories for the factors. So we have built environment, which includes speed limit. So it's the posted speed limit of the roadway. As we showed the last meeting, crashes on roadways with higher speeds or higher free flow speed are more likely to result in greater crash severity. Number of lanes on the roadway, where you typically have more lanes, you more likely have a result of greater severity. Signalized intersections, within a certain distance of signalized intersections, most crashes are said to occur within an intersection or in close proximity to those intersections. We also took into account roadway type, which was crashes by roadway functional classification, which, as we presented last meeting, crashes on principal arterials are more likely to result in greater crash severity, also greater crash occurrence. And then we also looked at proximity to facilities, such as sidewalks, bike lanes, greenways and trails, those sorts of things. And if you want to go to the next slide. We also took a look at destinations, proximity to school zones. Like we showed last time, once you exit that school zone, that quarter-mile school zone, you tend to see crashes go up. And then when we look at proximity to transit stops, we also see a higher percentage of crashes occurring within that close proximity. And then we kind of took a look at behavior. So we looked at traffic volume. Roadways with higher volume are likely to increase opportunities for conflict between vehicles and non-motorized users. We also looked at percent free flow, crashes in congested areas versus non-congested areas. As we showed last time, crashes are more likely to occur in moderately congested conditions. And then we also took a look at vulnerable populations, so the degrees of vulnerability in the crash area. So vulnerable populations are more likely to have a greater exposure to walking and biking given their non-vehicle travel patterns. These are also broken out into 9 different groups. Next slide. So to get these list of factors, we selected the top few hotspot locations across the region, and we took a deeper dive into the factors present at these locations. So in the light orange color, you see some of the hotspot locations for pedestrian crashes. And then in green, you see locations for bike hotspots. As we've shown in our crash hotspot analysis before, you tend to see bike crashes occurring in those urban centers. And if you want to go to the next slide, I'm going to show you a detailed example of how we did this desktop review. So here's an example of I-65 Trinity Lane. Some factors present at this particular location were transit stops. You can kind of see those lit up in the little blue squares. There was commercial in close proximity to residential areas, near vulnerable populations such as homeless communities, which you can see from Google Earth, a tent community pops up in the yellow circle right there, which we kind of found to be interesting. And then along Trinity Lane, we have sidewalks and bike facilities nearby. And the orange arrow is pointing towards a designated turn lane. Those are also present. And so if you want to go to the next slide, the reason why I said, lay out all the factors that we use, because we developed a matrix looking at all the factors present across several different locations for pedestrian and bicyclist, looking at if there's residential areas, non-residential areas, if there was retail nearby, on-street parking, pedestrian signals, crosswalks, if there was a facility present, a parking lot, garage, traffic volumes, free flow speeds, degrees of vulnerability, proximity to school locations, transit stops, those sorts of things. And so that led us to the index, which if you go to the next slide, you can see the results of a statistical model representation showing where conditions make non-motorized crashes more susceptible in red and less susceptible in blue. This one in particular is the output for pedestrian safety index. And then if you go to the next slide, you'll see just a slight change for the bicyclist index. Again, in red, you have areas that are more susceptible, not that more crashes are occurring there, just that the conditions are making it more susceptible for non-motorized crashes. And in blue, you see they're less susceptible. If you go to the next slide. I'm going to highlight over the next few slides some examples or scenarios where, for one, bike ped crashes are highly susceptible and they have occurred in that area in the past. I'm also going to show an area where bike ped crashes are highly susceptible and there haven't been crashes that have occurred there in the past. And then the last example will be a combination of varying susceptibility and historic crash locations. Next slide. Example 1 is of Nolansville, Pike, and Harding intersection. This is where you have a highly susceptible area and a high number of non-motorized crashes in the past. Here you have a 4-lane, highly traveled, moderately congested urban principal arterial with a 40-mile-per-hour speed limit. You do not have any schools or greenways in the vicinity. And if you go to the next slide, you can see what that area will look like from a satellite imagery perspective. And you can see that in this area, we do have sidewalks close by. We do have transit stops located there. And as you can remember from our last meeting, a majority of crashes occurred within close proximity to an active transportation facility and also near transit stops. So if you go to the next slide, you can see what this area looks like from street view. So here you can see you have multiple factors at play. You have 4-lane highway, you have a lot of traffic on this roadway, you also have sidewalks. And this area also goes through 9 out of the 9 degrees of disadvantage or degrees of vulnerability as well. If you go to the next slide. Here's an example of Bells Bend and Old Hickory Boulevard area. This is an area where you have high susceptibility, but there haven't been crashes that have occurred there in the past. What you have at this location is a 2-lane, not highly traveled or congested rural local road with a 50-mile-per-hour speed limit. You don't have any schools nearby, and you don't have signalized intersections. And if you go to the next slide, you can sort of see why this area shows up as highly susceptible. You do have off-road trails nearby, and you do have a signed shared route facility along this roadway. And if you go to the next slide, you can see just from street view what this would look like if you were biking or walking down this roadway. And just to note, this roadway does go through 7 out of the 9 degrees of vulnerability. Next slide. So here's a more complex example where you have a combination of varying susceptibility and historic crashes. On Thompson Lane down near Murfreesboro, you have a 2 to 3 lane urban minor arterial roadway with a 45-mile-per-hour speed limit. And you can see that some of the areas you do have crashes have occurred in the past, and then the area that is the most susceptible, you do not see crashes having occurred. If you go to the next slide, you can see that there are bike lanes present. There's no sidewalks in this area or transit stops, but there are 3 schools close by. And as we've mentioned before from last month's discussion, non-motorized crashes tend to go up across the region just outside of those school zones. So that could lead to a higher degree of susceptibility for non-motorized crashes. And next slide. Here you can see it from street view that the bike lanes, you have school zones all interacting in the same roadway. I do want to note that this roadway does go through 4 out of the 9 degrees of vulnerability. And then if you want to go to the next slide. So the main point, this is just the draft version of this index, and we really want to open it up for discussion in the early phase of this index to see if this really aligns with areas that are unsafe. Have we accurately captured some crash risk factors? Are there things that we should be considering that we haven't looked at yet? So we kind of just wanted to open that up for initial discussion or immediate reactions to see, where everybody was thinking. We'll obviously give you more time to provide feedback later on, but we just wanted to kind of open this up for discussion.
Thank you, Ashley. Robert, I think you have a reaction. Go for it.
Thank you very much. I'll dive in early, giving everyone else a chance to consider further. Yeah, that all looks really excellent. Thank you. Well done, Ashley, on that. Speed limits. You said you used speed limits as one of your determining factors in the built environment. Why not use actual speeds? I noticed that you've got free flow as one of your features, so you are using an actual traffic feature already on the site. So why not, instead of using speed limits, why not use actual speeds?
We use them in combination. So we looked at % free flow, but that was from our travel demand model output. So we don't necessarily have information on the local roads as much so, and there are a lot of crashes that tend to occur on those roads. So we just defaulted to the TRIMS database for speed limits. And that doesn't necessarily get at the speed at which, cars were traveling when they hit the person, or the speeds at which, people tend to drive, but free flow does get at that. It gets at what people would be traveling at giving, non-congested conditions. So that's why we took a look at volume, % free flow, as well as speed limits. So we tried to get at it from different angles. If that's answering your question. If anybody else wants to chime in, please feel free.
That's great. And then my other question is, if an alternative, and maybe this is to do with implementation rather than identification, but if an alternative is to route active transport users a completely different way and have them avoid the crash spot completely, I'm imagining, supposing a solution for crashes outside a school is actually to link that school to a greenway. So the greenway won't be inside the area you've studied, and you're studying only where the crash area is occurring. Is there any danger that the way you have focused on the existing crash locations and street types, is there any danger that that's going to prevent implementation that doesn't involve that street?
That's a great question. So I'm trying to think of the best way to answer that. So this is basically built off of the road network itself, and so we're letting the past crashes sort of drive what factors are the most important and how to weight those. And so basically we're finding the commonalities with the roadway that are getting crashes, and then areas where crashes are occurring, and trying to apply that to the region wide, just to sort of grab areas that, the conditions are right. There could be potential issues with conflict between vehicles and non-motorists. And so when we go to put in projects in those areas, or projects are going in those areas, we want to be mindful of those things. So maybe, advocating for those separate facilities instead of putting on-road facilities or something of that nature. I'll let Daniel fill in kind of the back end of that question, just because I'm not typically a planner. I'm more of a stats person. So I just want to get his input as well for a little bit more of a thorough answer.
Thanks, Ashley. And Robert, I think that's a really great question. I think that sort of what you said is putting in greenways to, I guess, reroute active transportation traffic. I think that is one strategy, but I don't think that the index constrains that to our only strategy. I think that what we're hoping is that this will, I guess, fuel our argument, and hopefully the arguments of all of you in advocating for safer facilities. So like a multi-use path, or better pedestrian crossing near schools, or near some of the commercial developments we've been looking at in our index. So I think that because the index looks at these crash areas on a more systemic level, that I think the next step is trying to figure out what the best countermeasures are, so that we don't have to always reroute active transportation traffic. Does that answer your question?
Yes. As I say, I think possibly I've moved on from analysis to implementation. I just wanted to raise the issue that we don't want the starting basis to rule out any possible solutions.
Right, and I don't think it will rule out any possible solutions. I think that we haven't really started having the implementation discussion, at least internally. So I think that's sort of one of the big reasons why we're presenting this draft to you, is because I mean, GNRC is not an implementation agency, and so really making this tool available to all of our local members and TDOT and you all, so that it can better inform what the implementation ends up being. Councilwoman Henderson, do you have a comment?
I do. Thank you, Daniel, and thank you, Ashley, for this work. From the Metro Council side, I can see we have tried over the last several years to have more objectivity and transparency through our capital spending program, and so I appreciate tools like this very much. And I wanted to ask, particular to Ashley, you mentioned number of lanes, but I'm wondering how or if width of lanes, presence of slip lanes, kind of how that factors in at all, if at all. And then for bikeway facilities, protected versus paint only versus sharrows, and kind of what happens when that's in proximity, especially paint only and sharrows, to higher speeds, and kind of how you were getting at that, if at all. Thank you.
So for number of lanes, we don't take into account the width of those lanes or anything. This is just straight out of Trend's database. So it just gives me, there's 2 lanes or 4 lanes, and we chose lanes, obviously because a lot of crashes tend to occur more, or at least disproportionately higher, on 4-lane roads. And to get at your point of different facilities, such as like protected buffered bike lanes, signed shared routes, and those sorts of things, we did take into account where we had data available. So protected buffer. I'm really sorry, struggling with words today. Words are hard. Protected buffer bike lanes, those tend to not have as many crashes on those as a signed shared route. So that would get more weight in terms of how I mathematically got to the index. So certain facilities are going to be safer than other facilities, if that makes sense. So that's the way that we're kind of incorporating that information. And then, like you said, for number of lanes, we don't really take into account width or anything like that. But if there was an area where, we were really worried about it, we could pull that information in and look at the, different measurements and specifications for that roadway. But as like a region wide, we just looked at typically number of lanes.
I appreciate that, the clarification. And then would I guess there's a roadway, right, so the preponderance of 4 lanes, center turn lane, but when you get to kind of the intersection, ostensibly where people should be crossing if they're not miles apart, does a slip lane then become like, so is it just kind of 2-lane road, 4-lane road, 5-lane, but can you share if slip lanes at all factor in to the index specifically?
I can't say that I've actually looked specifically at slip lanes. I know that I do have in the roadway network file, it'll tell me when it switches from a 3-lane road to a 2-lane road and at what point that switches. But I have not taken a look at those specifically, and that's something that we should, definitely take a look at. That's, why we wanted to go ahead and present it to you guys, to sort of get that feedback from people like you. So that's great. We can take a look into that.
Actually, I think I can add in a little bit on the slip lane conversation. I believe that the way that TRIMS has it coded in is that as you add a turn lane near an intersection, it is included. So those would be included for those areas, approaching an intersection. And as a response to your previous question, Councilwoman Henderson, on the lane width, that is a feature that we can look at. It's not very well reported. So it's something that we'll have to look at carefully. If that's something that you'd be interested in us maybe exploring deeper, I think it's something that we would definitely entertain looking into. Good point. I appreciate you bringing that up.
This is Sean. I'd just add that these are all good pieces of information too, as we look at like kind of the next level of these factors and how we can, what we might be capturing and what we are not yet capturing within the index. So, feel free to share any other comments or highlight any other factors that you think are worth capturing.
And I may be jumping a little bit ahead, but we will provide this file on our active transportation application, and it'll be interactive, so you can zoom in and examine it a little bit more and compare it against other crashes in the region, sidewalk facilities, bike facilities, those sorts of things. Perfect. I was right on time. And so this may be helpful for you guys to take with you after this meeting and sort of vet and look a little closer at if you'd like.
Thanks, Ashley. That was the next slide. I'll add on to that. We'll be sending you a survey so we can document feedback and you guys can have a little time, because I know we threw a lot of stuff at you today. So if you don't have any comments right now, or you're still trying to figure out what you want to say, we'll be sending out a survey along with the link to this application, so you can turn on the susceptibility index layer and look at specific locations that are dangerous or you think might be dangerous to sort of vet everything. So know that even if you don't have anything to say now, you will have the chance to provide us with feedback before we move ahead. So I'll go back to the question slide. Does anyone think that there are any factors that aren't important or shouldn't be considered? And then in the same vein, does anyone think there are any factors that are really important and we should definitely keep in the index and maybe take a deeper dive into?
Robert speaking again. My apologies if I've forgotten this, but is adjacent residential housing density a factor?
It was not an official factor that we included into the index this far. We did take a look at it when we were looking at the desktop review, where we had the mix of residential and close proximity to commercial, where people would tend to be walking from their home to a business or some sort. But no, that wasn't necessarily included in the index itself. But that is something that we could definitely take a look at, close proximity to different densities of residential areas.
And did the vulnerable populations, did any of those 7 factors, are they any of those derivative of housing density?
I think that those were based on, and I think Carson Cooper is on the call, she can correct me if I'm wrong, but those are based off the 9 different degrees of vulnerability. And those are areas where block groups in that area are higher than the regional average. So we did take into account that when we did the degrees of vulnerability.
So there is some correlation with housing density in one of those factors.
Yeah, I'm not, Carson can probably correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't know necessarily if it deals with housing density itself, but I just know that people within that block group, there's a higher percentage of those people, like either carless, single mom households, poverty, and those sorts of factors. So I don't know if it necessarily gets at housing density itself, but I know that it gets at the density of those vulnerable populations in those areas.
Yeah, Ashley, I think that points back to the intent of the tool of not representing that demand side of things. So where density is probably more indicative of activity, so like a higher likelihood of getting in a crash, it's not doing that. It's just saying the conditions are such that crashes will occur. So it's almost looking at it agnostically, right? Like you're taking all the demand out of it and just saying this roadway has these characteristics and is near maybe certain items like a school or a transit stop where crashes are occurring elsewhere, and then applying it universally throughout the region.
Yes, I'm having difficulty differentiating between prediction and analysis. I can see that. But thank you. You'll know that we at the BPAC have long been asking about prediction tools, and I hear that you're not wanting to use the word prediction, and fair enough. I'm just having some difficulty understanding that.
No, I think your point is great, and I think that's the step that we're wanting to go in, and the way that we're thinking about it right now is almost a combination of historical crashes, the latent demand, which gets at what you were speaking of, the housing density, the closeness of housing to things that they would like to walk or bike to, that demand part of it, alongside with this new tool being the index. And when you put all of those together, it paints the picture of where crashes are likely to occur. We just wanted to stop short of the predictive for this presentation because we're not quite there yet, but that's what we're cooking.
Thank you very much. And then I guess my only remaining question that comes to mind immediately is crosswalks. I don't know whether crosswalks increase or decrease crash frequency in any given location. But yeah, either crosswalk density or the presence or otherwise of crosswalks has not yet been mentioned.
Yeah, I think that was something difficult that we had to pull out of the database, like where the exact locations of crosswalks were. That's why we used signalized intersections as like a proxy for that. The database that we have doesn't necessarily have a complete list of all crosswalks in the region. So that's where we kind of hit a snag in getting at that, because yeah, a lot of accidents are happening in those crosswalks or in close proximity to those intersections. Like we've seen, people crossing before they get to the intersection or not having adequate infrastructure in place for them to cross safely. So that's a very good point.
Those are all really good points, Robert. Councilwoman Henderson, do you have a comment to make?
A quick question, just somewhat of a follow-up on the discussion around slip lanes and whether those would factor in. I am not actually clear on, so right turn on red and, particularly to a city or region or state, and, if that's always permissible unless otherwise posted. And so I think you said from a database standpoint, you could assess posted speed, but I didn't know, how I think just like for slip lanes that, right turn on red certainly is a negative factor often depending on the context for, pedestrian and bicycle safety. So I wonder if you can speak to right turn on red and how, from a data perspective, that would or could factor in, if at all. Thank you.
Yeah, to speak to that, I don't know if I haven't looked close enough at the details of the TRIMS database, whether or not that would be in there. Max can jump in if he's fully aware, but I don't necessarily know of a way that we could get at.
Yeah, I know that in the TRIMS database, it is not identified. There might be a sign inventory that would have it, but I agree with your comment. If it's not posted, no right turn on red, then it is permissible within the state of Tennessee, unless somebody on this call can correct me. What we haven't looked into, and we may work with our partners at Department of Safety, is to figure out how many crashes are occurring as a result of a right turn on red. And they may be able to pull that out of the crash reports, but I don't know a data way to solve that question, but there might be other ways to take a look at it. Good point. Thank you.
This is Ian from TDOT. That's a great point. I'm not exactly sure the data side, what our slip lane data is in trims, but I can talk to my guys in safety and see how we account for those sort of figures for slip lanes, because I'd like to know myself too. So yeah, thanks for that. I've made a note here.
I appreciate that. And I think there are some of us, I think, that also have kind of a policy interest in right turn on red and kind of how that intersects with, kind of underlying state, county, city, because I think at present it's allowed, best I understand, unless otherwise posted. But, I think for clarity standpoint, depending on context, I think it can be helpful just to in a similar way to lowering all our speed limits, right? And just saying no right turn on red. So I appreciate this the conversations around the safety index, but I was interested to understand kind of the data available or signage inventory on that, because I think it's of policy interest as well. Thank you.
Councilwoman Henderson, that's a really good point. Thank you for making that. I think what that brings to my mind is I think another reason we can use this tool is sort of to provide ammunition to conversations surrounding policy changes. So if we can better prove that a certain factor contributes to more severe crashes, then I think having the data behind it will give us just that much of a better argument when we're pushing policies like what you just mentioned. Justin, I see you have your hand raised. You can go ahead.
Hey, yeah, I just wanted to thank both Robert and Councilwoman Henderson for those questions. And chime in, I guess, to say that certainly both crosswalks and slip lanes are, areas of interest for us as we look at, safe and comfortable transit stops and safe access to those stops. While we've certainly been able to, identify some high ridership stops that have some of those issues, lack of crosswalk or, slip lanes that promote really high speeds through an intersection. We would like to be able to have a little bit more comprehensive data on there, and I know there's some data challenges there, but at least on our end, what we are doing, starting with tackling the high ridership corridors, is trying to sort of do an assessment of each stop pair location on the corridor and identify those gaps where we don't have a crosswalk or where the crosswalk is just insufficient or not up to standard. And then other factors like slip lanes or right turn only lanes that require that the bus stop be farther from the intersection. It's kind of a lot to tackle. So we're still trying to figure out how we want to manage that data, I guess. But we're at least starting to tackle that with those major corridors, which I think those tend to be the ones that pop up on the list of the most collisions. But just to add, for us, it's partially about trying to identify the top priorities for projects that we could pursue either at us or in partnership with Public Works on improving access to transit stops.
Thanks, Justin. I think that's a really great point. Does anyone else have any comments or reactions to what we've presented today before I move on? Again, we'll send out a survey and you'll have access to play around with the index. But I really appreciate the discussion we've had today. I think it's helped us understand what you guys think about the index and how we can move forward and take a deeper dive into the analysis.
Hey, Daniel.
Yeah, go ahead, Max.
I was wanting to respond to Robert's earlier question about the housing density. Now, after thinking about it a little bit more, I think it it is inadvertently captured in the roadway classification because roadway classifications do have the urban and rural designation, which is based off of housing density. It is in there, but we kind of snuck it in even on ourselves.
Thanks, Max. All right, well, I'm going to go ahead and move on, but just remember we'll be reaching out and you guys will be able to provide some more feedback on the index in the coming weeks. So we've talked about safety performance measure targets before, but as we'll be adopting updates to the performance measures at next month's Transportation Policy Board meeting, we wanted to give you guys an update today. So a bit of background. Federal law requires that TDOT and MPOs set performance targets for these 5 safety performance measures. So we proposed a number of scenarios to our policy board a few months ago on safety performance measures and targets, and what we'll be presenting to you today is the last of the 5 performance targets, which is the number of non-motorized fatalities and serious injuries. Before I hand it off to Ashley, I wanted to give a bit of context. So MPOs have traditionally supported the state's targets. I believe this is the first time we're looking to stray away from supporting the state's targets. We realize that this isn't enough, especially considering the past year of pedestrian fatalities, but we have to start somewhere. And so the 1% annual reduction was what our policy board had consensus on. So we want to strive towards Vision Zero, but we have to start somewhere. And setting a precedent that we need to be more ambitious than the state is a start. So Ashley Reeves on our staff has applied some of this target setting to non-motorized fatalities and serious injuries, as well as some preliminary data for safety for 2020. So Ashley, you can go ahead.
Awesome. So here we have a graph of, in gray, historic crashes for non-motorized fatalities and serious injuries. And you can see the dotted line, we had 2020 data preliminarily at the time this graph was made. But the 2 scenarios that we presented, one is to cap it at the baseline, meaning we take the 2015-2019 baseline value of 178.6 and we carry that out through the life of the plan. So the target for 2045 would be 178.6. Or if we take a 1% annual reduction scenario over the course of the plan, our target by the year 2045 would be 138. And if you go to the next slide, you can see that there's various options. So the first option was to support the state. Their target for 2017 to 2021 was 521, which was up from their 2015-2019 target. And it's important to note that the state adopts their targets for the next year. We're trying to look out over the course of the entire life of the RTP, so out to 2045. So like I said on the previous slide, if we cap the non-motorized fatalities and serious injuries at the baseline, our proposed target is 178.6. If we take the scenario of the 1% annual reduction, our proposed target is 137.5 with an average annual number of 157.2. And if we go to the next slide, I'm going to show a little bit more data for 2020. So in each of these graphs, the bright orange line is going to be 2020 data. And the other 5 colorful lines are 2015 through 2019's past data. And as you can see, at the beginning of the year, we started out trending similar to how we had the previous years. But as soon as, those stay-at-home orders went into effect and the pandemic, hit full force, we see that drop. Which is to say, not necessarily a pandemic's a great thing, but there are obviously lessons to be learned as we've moved that trend line significantly down. If you go to the next slide, you can see the breakdown for fatal non-motorized crashes. And for fatal crashes, we've been trending, a little bit lower than the previous years, but for the most part, similar to the previous years. But the most interesting one to me is the next one. When you look at non-motorized crashes by versus PED, we can see that in 2020, we were trending higher than any of our previous 5 years for fatal. We want, especially when you see that we were trending lower for overall non-motorized crashes, but unfortunately for fatal pedestrian crashes, we're trending higher than any of the previous 5 years. And if you want to go to the next slide, I don't know if I'm okay. So I'll turn it back over to Daniel there and see if y'all have any questions. Yeah, absolutely.
If anyone has any questions or comments, I think a lot of us have seen what's been happened or what happened in 2020, or sorry, my words are messing up too. In 2020, when it comes to pedestrian safety, and I know that Walk Bike, I think this weekend is doing their annual memorial for pedestrians who have been killed on our roadways. So we realized that 2020 has been one of the worst years on record, and now that we actually have the data to prove it, I'll open up the floor for any comments or questions on what we've presented.
It's just so hard not to be emotional. Right. It's just really hard not to be emotional. I get that. I understand that vehicle miles traveled and the number of residents is rising every year. I understand it. I also understand that I'm an advocate. I have neither the money, the budget, nor the responsibility for managing the transportation system. I get that I'm an advocate, but man, 1%. Yeah, I probably won't actually make any more comments other than, okay, let me try and make it statistically based. My question, what made you pick 1%?
So when we first presented this to our board, we looked at fatalities, serious injuries, and then non-motorized fatalities and serious injuries. And we took a look at the historical percent changes throughout the past, starting at 2005, moving forward to 2019 at the time we presented this. And we just looked at what was realistic. So we showed them a vision zero, we showed them a 50% overall decrease in fatalities, and then we showed them, 1% annual scenario, just to get the different distributions of target setting, and they voted to go with the 1% decrease. And so we decided to apply that to serious injuries and non-motorized fatalities and serious injuries. And unfortunately, yeah, 1% isn't as aggressive as we would like, but as Daniel has mentioned before, we had to get them to agree to something, and getting them to agree to a lower value or a lower target was a step in at least the right direction, which I agree with you, 1% isn't enough. But when we look across the historical trend, it's pretty ambitious to decrease it by 1% annually, just given the historic trend and the historic records show about an 8% increase every year. So yeah, I completely understand your frustration with the 1%, but that's where that value came from, was from the original presentation to our board.
Thank you, Ashley. I guess the only other calm comment I can make at this point is that if we believe there's going to be technological advances, if we believe that Vision Zero is going to create greater focus on safety for non-motorized travelers, then do we believe that there is greater opportunity for life saving further into the future, such that 1% compounded is not representative of the potential savings through culture changes, through technology changes, through policy changes, and that the target should get more aggressive towards 2045?
I was going to say, does Daniel or Matt, one of y'all want to take that?
Yeah, Robert, I think what may be getting lost here is with the transportation plan, we took the approach of how many lives can we save over the course of the plan. The targets are actually set and hopefully met I believe this is every 2 years. So like you said, as the paradigm may shift, so will our targets. So we'll continually look at our recent history and see how that will change the trend line or the expected trend, the expected number of crashes, and then obviously have a goal that is higher than that. So looking at what's attainable and then trying to achieve beyond that. Does that answer your question?
Yes, I suppose so. Then obviously I would question, why do you plan at all for 2045? But yes, that's a reasonable response. Thank you.
Thanks, Robert, for that comment. I mean, I totally agree with you. I think that hopefully if we can meet that 1%, then it would hopefully convince our board to support a more ambitious target like Vision Zero. And now that Metro Nashville is, and I think you guys are working on this plan too, the Vision Zero action plan, I think that it will hopefully change public opinion and make Vision Zero sound like a much more realistic goal for elected officials and decision makers. So, I mean, I hope that eventually we get to Vision Zero before 2045. So I would totally agree with you. Yeah.
And one thing I would add, Robert, just on this conversation too, is there's kind of a spirit at the national level of a goal to reduce fatalities and serious injuries, and I think the targets that have been set at the statewide level so far have been more tied to existing trends, and what we're trying to do through this discussion. I don't believe that there's any other MPOs in the state that have diverged from supporting the statewide targets and created their own regional targets, but we're trying to set a meaningful target and a goal to achieve over the life of that plan that is really going in the right direction as we see it, that is in line with those national goals of reducing fatalities and serious injuries. And then the other component I'd add to that is I think that provides the first step that we need to go in, but then the subsequent step, which all of us are involved with, is then how do we accomplish that? Because we've identified a number of projects and we've identified safety as our number one goal through the regional transportation plan, and that's reflected in the project evaluations. But obviously, there's a lot of different elements to achieve that safety, from education and enforcement, not only improvements at the local level as well as the statewide level, but all of that kind of has to be moving in the right direction across the region for us to achieve some of these targets. And I would say one of the hardest ones, or one of the most difficult targets to achieve, it looks like right now, is on the pedestrian front when it comes to pedestrian fatalities, as we've seen significant increases percentage-wise in that over some of the other modes.
Hey, Sean, this is Ian from TDOT, and if I could echo your comments and also Robert's. Robert, just for the committee here's information, Sean's correct in that TDOT has been partnering with, so the state sets their own safety standards, and we have our MPOs who are mandated to, of course, either adopt ours or enforce their own or adopt their own. And the Nashville MPO has taken efforts and steps to adopt their more I guess strenuous, you could say, or more intensive safety targets, so that we can start addressing these lives lost. I'm glad you have the passion that you do. I've joined you on multiple bike rides, and it's a shame that we have our human lives kind of represented on graphs, lines, and stats over years, and unfortunately, it's sometimes it's just between you and me. It's kind of the name of the game for the system, and we don't like to adopt Vision Zero campaign language all the time because it's tough on paper to look back and see, are we actually meeting goals? But I do think that Sean Falzer is right in saying that, one of our ways in addressing that is to adopt our own locally. And so we're not just blanketing safety targets. We're actually honing in on the local Nashville area's data and people. And so that I can say very confidently is indeed a step in the right direction. And TDOT is always looking for ways to improve that communication with our other MPOs. And it is a pat on their backs to say that, through representation, they have adopted their own targets, and we are backing them up on it. So I totally agree. It's a shame the way the system is kind of in place, but we're doing the best we can, and that's why we have these meetings here, is to continue fighting for those hard targets, but fighting even harder to meet them. So I appreciate you being on here, and we all have been hearing what you're saying. So thank you for being honest and keeping us honest as well. That's all.
Thanks, Ian. So we're coming up about 1 o'clock, so I'm gonna quickly go through our member updates. I just want to introduce Jessica Hill, who is our new Community and Regional Planning Director here at GNRC. Prior to joining GNRC, Jessica worked at the Central Carolina Regional Council in Charlotte, North Carolina, most recently serving there as the Assistant Director of Regional Planning. She brings a lot of experience in land use and transportation planning, so please welcome her to the Nashville region. You can reach her at the email address on the screen. And quickly, I'll hand it off to Anna Emerson at GNRC, who will give us a quick update on COVID relief funding.
Hi, everybody. I'm sorry for that quick delay. I'm actually kind of trying to participate in 2 meetings right now. Anyway, we just wanted to give everyone an update on the latest Consolidated Appropriations Act that Congress passed at the beginning of the year. It includes some additional funding related to COVID relief, and we expect that people who follow along with GNRC and our funding availability and project discussions are going to hear us be talking in the near future about some potential additional funding. The bill includes $9.8 billion available to states, and Tennessee's estimated allocation is going to be about $209 million. Metropolitan areas with populations over 200,000, so our larger MPO type areas are expected to receive about $22.3 million, with Nashville expected to receive about $7.9 million. This funding is going to be at 100% federal share, so it will not require typical local or state match to be able to use that funding, which is going to be a huge advantage to anybody receiving it. And it's going to have a 4-year expiration timeline placed on it. So we are going to need to expend that funding pretty quickly. We do not at this time have the ability to announce any plans for us appropriating this funding to projects. We're still waiting on some clarification about any restrictions that are placed on how we allocate that funding, as well as any nuances that are attached to the eligibility of that funding, or if it will be a broadly applied eligibility like an STBG funding or something similar typically is. So We're going to keep everyone posted as soon as we're able to while we await some further information, but we did just want to let everybody know about this additional funds that we expect.
Thank you, Anna. Miranda, do you want to quickly update us on Metro's Vision Zero action plan?
Yes. Yes, with this conversation today, I wanted to just invite anybody who wanted to be involved in this process to contact me by email. There will be a lot of opportunities to be involved. And I think, you know, it's clear that this action plan is, you know, needed right now. And there's a lot of foundational research and work that has been done already. So this will be trying to pull all of that together. But as I said earlier, the contract has been finalized. We're having our first kickoff meeting mid-February. And then following that, we'll be getting onto the Vision Zero task force meetings. There'll be a series of those. And then there'll be a community engagement process. We will be setting up a Metro website for Vision Zero, and it will have an interactive ArcGIS site for people to go on and submit their thoughts and complaints and their personal user experiences and traffic safety concerns. We will also be doing some public engagement through public focus groups. There'll be a focus on equity throughout the process. There'll be stakeholder listening sessions for various different groups, including government groups, and then advocacy groups, and then university hospital groups, and then we'll have a whole separate focus group for TDOT. So because TDOT does have so much say and impact on so many roads in Nashville, we felt that they required a whole separate focus group for TDOT. Let's see. I guess I should say right up front too, Alta Design has been hired for that, and they have experience with Vision Zero across the country. Let's see. They'll be doing a crash data assessment and analysis. A little while ago, we sent out an information request for our partners with GNRC Public Works for data that's available. We really pushed for Alta to take the lead on data collection, so some of you who have been working on that will most likely be contacted and requested for sharing the information you've pulled together already. We will be getting data on police and health information. And then they will be doing a systemic safety analysis, and they'll be looking at crash profiles and coming up with a high injury network map. They'll also be looking at our the corridors throughout Nashville, as is clear that most of the crashes and pedestrian fatalities occur on those. And they will be taking one corridor to do a focus study on. And that corridor has not been chosen yet, but will be as the project kicks off. And there'll be a focus group with that too, made up of people from the area, from residents, etc. Let's see. The action plan, with a timeline on it, is we expect that the action plan will be completed by the end of the year. So that's kind of just a brief overview. Does anyone have any specific questions or anything on that? And I'd be happy to come and give a more detailed overview of that at a future meeting if needed. Hello?
Thank
Can you hear me?
Miranda. I was waiting for anybody that had questions.
Oh, okay. For a minute there, I was wondering if I was on mute or something. Yeah, so.
I think that, so I'm going to reach out to you and get some more information on this so that I can send it out in a follow-up email.
Oh, that would be great.
And then people will have more information. And I think it's also a good idea that you had to come and present at a future meeting. So I'll follow up with you about that.
Okay, sounds good.
Does anyone else have any updates before we adjourn the meeting?
Hey, this is Justin at WeGo. Just wanted to let everyone know that we have public comment open for spring service changes. Obviously, you know, spring last year, we were implementing emergency service reductions, and we've been at various levels of reduced service since then. So we're actually adding back service in most places to try and accommodate what could be a rebound in ridership coming, and to ensure that you know, we're limiting loads to the extent that we can on our busiest routes. But of course, we still won't be at full service, and so anyway, yeah, public comment is open for all of those proposed changes now, and there's information on our website.
Robert, I see your hand raised. Go ahead.
Great, thanks very much, Daniel. At the risk of repeating, I know that Nora attended this meeting last time, not myself, but our roundup is yes. Thank you very much for everybody, most of whom are represented on this meeting, that is consulting with us. So we're certainly looking forward to being in the Vision Zero process, which we're currently in, so that's great. Similarly, yes, the publicity and the education component around the speed limit reduction, we're certainly involved with that. That's great. We've had a couple of people in Walkbank Nashville produce some data analysis of pedestrian crashes, and we've also kicked into gear a bit our Families for Safe Streets chapter, the Nashville chapter of Families for Safe Streets, which is a national non-profit dedicated to honouring those who've died in crashes and getting something done about it. That chapter has really been moving forwards, and we've had some good press and some good media, and we're going to be supporting that on an ongoing basis by producing reports and data about the pedestrian crash statistics around Nashville. So we've had a couple of webinars about that. I know that TDOT and local Metro people have been on those webinars, and that's been great. We've done some educational webinars with the traffic calming division. That's gone really well. So yeah, our focus at the moment is on hopefully partnering with the speed limit reduction and with Vision Zero initiatives to promote the importance of pedestrian safety in Nashville and to promote the problems that there currently are. So I'd encourage anybody to sign up for one of our webinars or to sign up for petitions that they see supporting action on that. Thank you.
Thanks, Robert. Ian, you've got your hand raised.
Yeah, thanks, Daniel. Real quick, I'm going to give a couple updates. I'll be very brief. So on our last BPAC call, Councilwoman Henderson had asked me about TDOT's multimodal design guidelines and the best way to include safety countermeasures into metro plans and into TDOT plans. To that, I would say to you and all of our folks on the call is just get in touch with me or our multimodal division. We'd be happy to help you navigate them. And as far as getting those guidelines in on the TDOT side, that is a process that our multimodal folks are working on hard to address. Also, particularly in the statewide active transportation plan, the SATP. Councilwoman Henderson, did you have a quick comment on that? Okay, sorry, I thought I heard something.
No, just express my thanks. Thank you, Ian.
Okay, sure thing. Yeah, absolutely. And that statewide active transportation plan will be going out for public review very soon, hopefully in the next couple of weeks. I have an infographic that I'm going to send to Daniel to send out to all of our members. It is kind of a summary in infographic form on the public input that we received on the development of the SATP. And so I can include that for your perusal as well. It's a neat little infographic. So that is on the development of it, and then once it's once the plan itself is released, you can of course comment on that, and we'll be receiving that. You can go through our multimodal division for that. I'll put their email and my email in this chat box, and I'll also give that to Daniel. And lastly, real quick, the multimodal access grant cycle for this year, our multimodal folks have received 64 full applications across the state. 8 of them were from our Nashville area MPO. And those 8 are represented from Brentwood, Gallatin, Hendersonville, Mount Juliet, Murfreesboro, Nolansville, Smyrna, and Springfield. So those are the 8 from our area. Our multimodal division will be scoring those. Well, they are scoring those right now as we speak, and we'll be making awards in late spring. So if you have any more questions about that, I'd be happy to take them now, or in the interest of time, maybe on another email to me would be just fine. And so that is all I have. Thank you, Daniel.
Thanks, Ian. Quickly, Sean, since I see you have your hand raised as well.
Hey, Daniel. Yeah, nothing too significant. I wanted to ask if you guys have had a chance to consider the Safe Transportation for Every Pedestrian workshop. Daniel, I don't know if you guys are planning to still try to carry out that training, or.
Yeah, we are planning to do that. I'll be looking at the dates either today or tomorrow, and we'll get back to you guys on that,
Okay.
and hopefully get our TCC and BPAC involved.
Okay.
All right. Well, sorry to go over, but thank you to everyone for the discussions we've had today. I'll follow up with everything I said I would, and I hope everyone has a good rest of your day.
Thanks, Daniel. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks all.